We're still in the life of Paul. The plan is got today's lesson, and as you'll see, it's the, let me help without turning this on, his final journey. And then in the book that you have, there's two more lessons in there. One of them's talking about his sufferings, and the other one's talking about his prayers, and we'll do those two. And then right after that, we're going to go into the book of Hebrews. I've got some student books from Regular Baptist Press up here. If y'all want one of these for the book of Hebrews, we'll be dealing with that. So in about 3 weeks, we'll be doing the book of Hebrews. My son Jonathan, of course, is helping me out, and we're going to tag team, try to go through the book of Hebrews together if we can. Of course, my work goes in cycles, and then hits about October again, it goes through it again. So that's the way things work, unfortunately for me. We're getting close. This is to the end of Paul's life, of course, is what we're going to talk about today. I know it's been a long journey for some of y'all. We're going through all these lessons. And I looked at my book, the big book I gave y'all. I wrote in the very beginning of my book when we started. We started a year ago. Though we didn't have time, not every week we worked on this, but you see, we're on lesson 32. So it's taken quite a bit of the year trying to get through this part of Paul's life. We could have gone through the book of Acts in 13 weeks and been done and walked away from it. But hopefully we've learned something as we've gone through Paul's life, because there's so much there about him. And this is even trying to condense some of that as we go through that. But you read through his epistles to learn of him and learn his thoughts and what he was doing and how he was dealing with the churches and the burden on his heart for other people. So you're going to be in 2 Timothy quite a bit this morning. I don't know if you remember this last week. We showed this last week. And the key thing is right here, 68 AD. I mean, I know I didn't do a very good job covering that area there, because I don't know. It's all in that kind of gray area of information trying to work with. Did Paul go to Spain? Did he do this? We just don't know. We're just trying to piece it together, reading from the epistles and what things we can understand. But we do know that he eventually was martyred. And at what year it is, I've got the year here, about 68 AD. Some people got it at 66, 67. It's in that range. Nobody knows for sure exactly. But it's about that time. So let's go into this. The final journey. How are you doing on your journey? We're all on a journey. You think about it. From the time you were born to the time you die. And I know we're all raising our hand. I'm going to be waiting for the rapture. You don't know that. We don't know when the rapture is going to take place. And we don't know death will take place. And of course, some of us already experienced family members and friends who've already experienced death already. So how are you doing on your journey right now? And so keep that in perspective and thinking about Paul coming to the end of his journey now. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Think about that. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. I know we hear that phrase, okay, I've heard it and that's great, and we move on. But think about that. The Lord loves us, he saves us, but he wants us to live for him, does he not, every day? He strives, he wants us to I can't say he strives, but he helps, he tries to encourage us to grow, to know more about him. I mean, we got saved, he could just, okay, you got saved, you're gone. I'll take you right on out of there. Lord could have took us out just like that, but he doesn't do that, does he? Some people, yes, but some people, most of us, no. You get saved, and then you got that journey you got to make through life. But eventually, if death takes us, to him, it says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints, to be with him. So, Paul's final journey, the fire of persecutions. Remember Nero? Nero, and we're going to talk about the final imprisonment of Paul. Here's the two main points of this lesson here. So, about 64 AD, about July or so, they think Nero was the one who started the fire in Rome because he wanted to build a new building. In order to do that, he thought, well, I'll clear out some places to make it better. And of course, there's a lot of things against Nero. So to divert from him, he had a fire started. They believe that's what happened. And the fire consumed for like 6 days of Rome. Of course, with people, they're panicking what to do. So he strives what to do. Points towards the Christians. It's the Christians' fault. They're the ones who did it. And this opens up the door for the Roman persecution. This is one of the first of 10 Roman persecutions The government, think about it, a Roman government sanction of a persecution is what happened here. And this is the first of 10. I've got these, I'm going to show these briefly. I'm not going to dwell in these. I'm just going to show it to you so you know. I did this little timeline for you about these years when these emperors did these persecutions. I'm going to throw them all up here for you. These 10 persecutions about that time. Now, it doesn't say, okay, persecution, okay, on this year it stopped and then we're all nice and free and happy and go lucky. No, but it's when these emperors got into place and they took over, how they emphasized their persecution of Christians. Regardless if it's 100,000 people or one person is still one person who died in a persecution, no matter who it is. And there's thousands upon thousands of Christians who were persecuted and died through all these persecutions. And we think, well, that's in the past. Well, we also have that today. My son brought out the other day, I mean, I know it's overwhelming for us, and it's a good point that he brought out about that it is overwhelming to us. We hear about even modern day events, and like in Africa and tribes and all that they do, the things they do against each other. But Christians are being persecuted today, are going through that, unfortunately. So now let's go into Paul. That's the setting. So let's go into Paul's life now about this final journey. So Paul's arrest. So he was probably arrested in Troas. If you turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4. Now you're going to be in 2 Timothy quite a bit. We're going to be bouncing back and forth on different parts of the book here. But the reason we say possibly in Troas, because his statement in here, remember I told you last week, when he wrote the 2 Timothy, we believe this was the last book he wrote before he was leaving. And you'll see that later on as we go through if you haven't already seen that already. But in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he says in verse 12, Antiochus have I sent to Ephesus, the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus. When thou comest, who's he writing to? Timothy. He says to Timothy, when thou comest, bring with thee the books and especially the parchments. So the indication is that possibly in Troas is where he was arrested and all those things had to be left behind. He was taken into custody by the Romans. That's only how we're piecing this together. It's a likely scenarios, I guess you want to call it. He was taken to Rome and placed in the Mamertine prison. His friends had to search for him and to find him out. This is called the Mamertine prison in Rome, and what it kind of like, you know how they do a little display and all that, but there's down in the ground, it's a dungeon-like where he had to be stayed at. They believe that's where Paul was taken to and kept in Rome. But in 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 7, chapter 1 and verse 7, it says, I don't think it's 7, I think it's 17. Verse 17. Verse 16, the Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chain. Verse 17, but when he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently and found me. So the indication is that this, remember we talked about that last week, his second imprisonment. His first imprisonment, where was he at? His first imprisonment, where was he at? First Roman. His first Roman imprisonment, where was he at? Well, that narrowed it down. The whole empire, we narrowed it down. Rome. He was in his house, was he not, for 2 years? So people came and went. They came to visit him. We're able to see him. He's able to share the gospel. Now, this time, we believe it's the second Roman imprisonment. He's in a dungeon now. And now they had to find where is he at. He's not in a house for 2 years anymore. He's down in chains and down in this dungeon here is where he's at. And it's in Rome. Okay? Sister Stanford, I don't mean to make fun of you, sister. I just, you know. We can't laugh at ourselves. Everybody else is going to laugh at us anyways. Paul's accuser. So who is Paul's accuser? What we believe at this. So there's 5 guys who are named Alexander. I didn't come up with this. I came from that New Testament commentary to share this with you. But there's 5 guys mentioned in the New Testament known as Alexander. And we'll say who it is here in a moment. But give you an idea. Here's the son of Simon the Syrian who carried the cross in Mark chapter 15, verse 21. There's a Jewish leader when Peter and John were arrested, and a believer apprehended in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19 and verse 29 through 34. We read about that in the book of Acts when that happened to that Alexander there. This other Alexander possibly is a believer that denied the faith in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 through 20. If you'll turn there, 1 Timothy chapter 1, 19 through 20. Well, let's do verse 18. This charge I commit unto thee, son Timothy, according to the prophecies which went before on thee, that thou by them mightest war a good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience, which some having put away concerning faith have made shipwreck, of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have delivered unto Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. So that's who we think this might be, is that Timothy, this Alexander there. So the coppersmith in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14. And this is why we think this is the person who was instrumental in Paul's being arrested. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 14. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. And this is just piecing this together, trying to figure this out. This is the Alexander who was very instrumental in getting Paul arrested. Think of this time when the persecutions are taking place. Who is Paul? Paul is very well known as a leader of the Christians as well. And so whoever this Alexander was, he may have been a believer who denied the faith. He may have been, we don't know for sure, but it's just trying to piece this together. Yes, Sister Terry.
So the Alexander in 1 Timothy 1, 19 and 20 is the same as the coppersmith?
That's the indication that we're thinking, from what I've read and commentaries as well, thinking that's the one. Because he had already disciplined him, they think maybe he might have stirred something up to get Paul out of revenge, which is a sad situation, even in a church situation where church members turn on each other. And it does happen. And as if this was one of those believers who turned on Paul. We don't know for sure, but that's just piecing this together. Possibility. The coppersmith. I put that down, and this came from that Baptist New Testament commentary for you. So I didn't come up with that. I'm not that smart, so I had to come up with these points and look all this up. So his abandonment. Paul talks about his abandonment being in prison here. Think about Paul traveling around and those who have traveled with him, people who were close with him all the time. I mean, he didn't just travel by himself, and Luke was with him. You'll see that as well. But those who were with him were close friends. Now, some he had to send. He sent them to different areas to go to different areas to go to. But there are some that abandoned him. And as you read through 2 Timothy, and I was reading through this yesterday, I was just amazed at how much he brings that out about these. And hopefully you'll see what I saw. First, 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy mother. How did I get this? I think it's 15. I'm not putting enough, 15, I'm sorry. This thou knowest, that all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. What did he say there? What did he point out? I'm sorry, it's chapter 1, verse 15. But what did he say about Asia? Asia's were those churches that he spent a lot of time in, reaching those people, being there for, part of that time. He was in one place for 3 years almost. But reaching those churches there, and what did he say right here? They turned away from him. How devastating can that be? You're the kind of like the father to a lot of these new babes in Christ out there in the churches that have grown and established that. And what they do, so we don't want nothing to do with Paul. He says here, this thou knowest, that all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. Were these the two guys who were instrumental into that? Possibility were instrumental in turning others against Paul. That's hard to fathom, that they had been introduced to the gospel and from the scriptures from Paul and Paul preaching to them, and yet they were turned away from them, away from him. The next passage here, hopefully I got the right passages, chapter 2, verse 17 and 18, he says, and their word will eat as doeth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection passed already, and overthrow the faith of some. He points out two other people who've also turned others away. Two others who are instrumental in doing this. What he says about that, and their word will eat as doeth a canker. And he names the two guys here, and he says, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. Isn't that amazing? There's people within the church that are overthrowing and putting out false doctrine and affecting others, and are following that. And Paul points that out again. Another point here, he says in chapter 2 and verse 26, he says, verse 25, in meekness instructing those that oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. Might be wrong on this point, but I think there's Christians that are being influenced by Satan. They're being drawn away, being deceived. And Paul is concerned about them as well. His heart is broke about this, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil. Can we get snared in? Can we get trapped into things? I'm saved. That can't happen. Yeah, we can get our eyes off the Lord, can't we? We get our eyes off the Lord and get onto the world, we kind of get further away. And we don't read his word like we should every day. It's going to affect our lives if we're not close to him. And I know they didn't have the full scriptures with them. I understand that. But they did have his letters. They had Paul's admonition and the epistles that he had. Some of them probably already had them in circulation at the time, whatever it might be. But there's people here that Paul addresses that they were taken out of he prayed that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. Another point he brings up, of course, we're familiar with this. Let me back this up. For Demas, chapter 4, verse 10, we're very familiar with this. We hear this. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica. Isn't it interesting that Paul identifies a guy that used to work with him, somebody he knows, and says what about him? He's forsaken me. And why did he forsake Paul? What does it say here? Very obviously, he loved the present world. Can that happen to us? Can that happen to us in our lives if we're not careful? Can we not get our eyes off the Lord Jesus Christ and say, I like what the world's got going on over here. It's more interesting. It's more exciting, things I can do. The church is boring. You go there, you sit and pray, you walk out the door, and it's all boring. The world's more exciting. They got more glitter and stuff, things that draw my attention to. We can do it. It can happen to anyone in this room. We're not immune to that. But we have to be on guard constantly. And this is what Paul brings out about these people that he's worked with. He's been beside these people. He's been close to them. And if they've done what? They turn away for Paul. And they've gone, whatever region, they've gone in a different direction, like Demas did. The last one here, chapter 4, verse 16, he brings up, at my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Isn't it kind of a sad commentary? One of the greatest men in the scriptures of the New Testament with the church and all that, he says what? All have forsaken me. I know we don't put our trust in people. We're not to put our trust in people. It's better to trust in the Lord to put confidence in man. I understand that. But it's always good to have a good friend, isn't it? You like to have a good friend, somebody who can stand with you. You feel like you got somebody who's at least standing with you somewhere, But he says, they've all forsaken me. They've all left me. Now, he's going to talk about Luke here. Luke is with him at this time. But all those others who just left him, who would not stand with him. Some people look, well, Paul, you're in trouble, and you're not going to be, it's not going to look good for you. So I don't want to stand next to you. I'm going to be over here. Just like those who, like Peter and them, when they denied Christ. Aren't you Peter? Aren't you one of his disciples? No, I don't know him. I don't know him. And somebody else asked Peter the same question. No, and he cursed. I don't know him. Another young lady asked him, but I don't know him. He cursed and swore, Peter, and walked away. People that desert. So Paul brought this about, talked about this abandonment that he was dealing with as well. of those who left him. His admonishment. Interesting, here's a guy who knows he's under arrest. He knows it's not looking good. If you read 2 Timothy, you can see this, and we'll talk about, if you're not already familiar with it, he says, in verse 6 and 8, for I am now ready to be offered. He knows this is the end. This is it. But it's interesting, when he writes this epistle, he gives admonishment to Timothy. So Timothy, yeah, I've gone through some things, and I've got people who have deserted me, but I want you to realize something. For the church and for you, to help you to realize a few things. And I got a few things I'll point out to you that he pointed out in the scriptures here. Chapter 3 and verse 1 through 7, he says, this know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. What does perilous times mean to you? Dangerous, rough, troublesome. Not good, is it? It's not good times. He said in the last days, and Paul wrote this when? About 67 AD, 68 AD, we don't know. That's a long time ago. And he's even talking about the last times and where are we at in our year, He said, this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. And then he goes on, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accuser, incontinent, fierce, despiser of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure, more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. Now, he wrote this when?
67 or 68.
And what is today? Doesn't sound like today. Just sounds like today to us. Paul's talking about it then, but it's also talking about just like it is today. You go down to that whole list and you see that around you now. Do we not already see that in our life and our culture around us? These events? And Paul says what? From such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. We'll go to verse 8 here. He says in verse 8, he says, now as Janus and Jambres withstood Moses. Now he's using an Old Testament illustration about these two guys. He's saying, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith. Paul's saying in their time they've had this trouble with people as well, being reprobates of the faith. We also have it today. Don't think we don't. We have people who are turning their back on the Lord Jesus Christ, turning their back on what they've heard. I went to church, but I might have got saved when I was a kid, but I'm not sure really. I don't know. But I'm going to go ahead and live my own life my own way. I just do it my own way. That church stuff is not really important to me anymore. Did you get saved? Did you not get saved? And are you living for the Lord? Another point. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse. He goes further down, chapter 3, verse 13. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. People have what? A sinful nature. They have a sinful nature. They had them back then. They have it here in 2018. Doesn't matter what year you're in. People still have a sinful nature. And Paul's talking about people being, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse. I don't know about you, when I was a kid, a long time ago, lived in Texas, played out where I lived at. I could go out in the desert. I could play all day, be gone all day. Saturday, be gone. My mom just knew I was out there playing somewhere, catching lizards and whatever else I can find out there. Didn't worry about me. Some of us kids just go across the street and just played. At night, we'd be out there playing in the hide and seek in the dark, running around the neighborhood, hiding from each other, playing around. Never thought nothing about it. How about you now today? My grandkids are not out of our sight. In this day and age, you don't let them out of your sight because there's so much people that have gotten worse and worse things going around us. And we do not let them out of our sight. Some of y'all lived in those kind of pleasant times where you as kids were able to go and just play and run around all day. You just had a good time, no matter what. We're safe no matter where we're at. It was nothing for me to go stand out there and call for my sister, who was a lot younger than me. Carla. My mom said, go get your sister. I stand outside and call for her. Here she comes running across the street, down the street, one of the kids' house. Never thought nothing of it. Today, like I said, our grandkids don't leave our sight. We know exactly where they're at. Some of y'all, probably your kids that you have, if you still have kids, and many grandkids, I know where they're at, and I know who they're with to make sure they're safe. Paul addressed this situation back then about how evil, and it gets worse and worse. Chapter 4 and verse 3, he brings up, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having each itching ears. You think with Paul being there and the greatest guy who the Lord used to write all the epistles and lead people to the Lord and to start the churches and all that, but he's bringing up that there's going to be people that are going to start denying the doctrine, start denying the scriptures. And what do you say here? For there will come a time when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust. Go after their own lust. Talks about that he's admonishing Timothy to be aware. Paul's assurance. Paul is getting ready to be executed, and Paul has assurance no matter what. Chapter 1, verse 12, he says, and this is a very well-known passage for most people, for the which cause I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. How many of us can say that no matter what? To know that I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed against that day. Paul had that assurance. He talks about all these things in this epistle and the things he's gone through. He says, but I still got my eyes on the Lord. Next passage here, he talks about it. Chapter 2 and verse 19, he says, nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, the Lord knoweth them that are his. And let every one that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity. Nevertheless, talked about all these bad situations. He says, nevertheless, the Lord is still in control, and he's the one to trust. Chapter 4, verse 17, he says in verse 17 and verse 18, notwithstanding, the Lord stood with me, strengthened me, that by me the preaching might be fully known, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. And the Lord shall deliver me from every evil work, and will preserve me unto his heavenly kingdom, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. And you're thinking, Paul, you're going to get executed. He said, but what? I'm going to be with the Lord. It don't make any difference. I'm going to be here on the earth. I'm going to be in heaven. I'm going to be with the Lord. I'm with him. He's with me now. And what did he say here? He's always been with me. He said in verse 17, notwithstanding, the Lord stood with me. When everybody went away and left him, he said what? The Lord stood with him no matter what. And strengthened me, and by me the preaching might be fully known. That's how we should be, no matter what our lives are, what we're dealing with. That we know that we still, Lord, we're still walking together. We can be together. He wants to be with us. He wants to stand with us. So towards the end here, I'll put all these up there for you. But 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6. Paul says, For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. Not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. We're so familiarized with this passage, are we not? We hear it. We're so familiarized with it. But the thing about what Paul had just said to Timothy here, I'm ready. I know my course is done. He says, I know I have nowhere else to go. There's no desire to go anywhere else. This is it. I finished it. And he says, I faithfully have served this. Not that he's bragging, look how great I am. But he says, I know that I've walked with the Lord. And I've done everything I possibly could to walk with him. And then he says, I have fought a good fight. Not a half a fight or part of a fight. It says, I fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Not part of the faith. I have kept the faith. Fully stuck with it. Was there many times Paul could have thrown in the towel? Would we have not have thrown in the towel the things that Paul had gone through? We have done it. We probably would have thrown in the towel just like that. Wouldn't took much. But all the things he went through, and we'll talk about that next week. All the things he went through, he still stuck with it. And he was ready. What about us in our journey? Are we ready with our journey? The dash. On a tombstone, now if you've noticed it, and you probably have at times, and where they are, there's a dash up there. This is a poem I found. It took me a while to find it, but I had heard of it before, by Ron Chandmer. It's called The Dash Between. I knelt there at the headstone of one I loved and cried. Now with dates of birth and death were perfectly inscribed. I pondered these two dates and how little they both mean when compared to the tiny dash that lies there in between. The dash serves as an emblem of our time here on the earth, and although small, it stands for all our years of life and worth. And our worth will be determined by how we live each day. We can fill our dash with goodness or waste our life away. To ourselves as well as others, let's be honest, kind and true, and every day live the way we know God wants us to. May we look for opportunities to be a worthy deed and reach out with compassion to those who are in need. For if our hearts are full of love throughout our journey here, we'll be loved by all those who knew us, and our memory they'll hold dear. And when we die, these memories are being grateful, loving tears to all whose lives were touched by the dash between our years. That dash represents our years. I'm going to tell you a story about a guy. He was married, had a family. He served in Vietnam twice, came back twice from Vietnam. It's amazing to go there and come back twice. But he had a drinking problem. And he'd be drunk and be gone and sometimes would leave his family. Eventually, he got a divorce. Not because he wanted it, but his wife wanted a divorce. Couldn't live with this anymore. So he got a divorce. So then he winds up getting remarried again. He has another family. He does what he can, got a little bit of an army retirement plan, trying to work with that, and does odd jobs to take care of his other family. But then he winds up getting cancer one day. And then he realizes his soul is important. And he realized he needed to trust the Lord. And he got saved. By this time, he's 69 years old when he gets saved. A life that was not serving the Lord, a life that was for his own, but he got saved. A few months later, he passed away. But before he passed away, he went to the hospital. And he's sitting in the hospital, and he says to everybody, I'm going home. Everybody says, well, you can't go home. You don't got much longer here. He says, no, but I'm going home tonight. They said, well, you can't. You're not in good shape. You're not going to make it. No, but I'm going home tonight. That was on a Friday night. Saturday morning, he was home. That was my dad. A man who wasted his life. Not like Paul, who served the Lord for all those years, but a man who had a wasted life in a way. But he got saved. But you know what? Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. No matter if it's Paul, who's the greatest man on earth, or a guy who was not very good at everything, but just made a living the best he could. But they were still what? Saints in the Lord. What about us? When the Apostle Paul was at the end of his journey on earth, he was concerned with others and the church. When you see the 2 Timothy, hopefully you see that. He was concerned for Timothy, for what he was going to have to face, because Paul said, my time is done. But Timothy, there's still challenges here. And you're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to recognize that. And he was concerned for the churches. As all those things I showed you, he pointed out of the troubles that were going on already at that time. Apart from the rapture, death will come to all of us, no matter what our walk of life is. Be you a person like the Apostle Paul, great teacher, soul winner, whatever it might be. You might be the greatest, or you be the guy who died in a hospital a few months after getting saved with a wasted life in a way. You know, we're all going to die someday unless the rapture takes place. And we're all voting, I want the rapture. But we don't know when that's going to happen. But we need to be ready. Are you ready for your dash to be placed on the headstone? I had an aunt by marriage. She's 93, by one of my aunts, whatever. She's 93 years old, not direct aunt, but she passed away. 93 years old. But you see the obituary. Interesting lady, what she did. But you know, if the obituary is only so long, can only capture so much of her life for 93 years like that. Are you ready for your dash to be placed on your headstone? What will your dash mean to others? If death was to take one of us and we go to the funeral and we go to see the headstone, we see our years. We're sitting there calculating, well, you know how old that person was? You know, I outlived them. You know, or I'm getting close to their age. But what will your dash really mean to others? And the last point is, most importantly, what would the dash mean to the Lord? That's the most important part. What does it mean to the Lord? Did we serve Him faithfully, no matter what? That's my last point. Anybody else have any comments, any questions? Yes, Pastor. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's right. It is amazing. And if y'all heard that, what the pastor said on verse 16, I know I didn't dwell on it too much, but where he said, but all men forsook me, I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. What a Christ-like spirit that is, and how that should be about us in our lives. Anybody else? Anything else?
What brings out, John, that this life, the Christian life, is not about us. It's about what we're doing for the Lord. That's all it's going to matter.
Yeah.
What's going to count in terms, what we've done for Him.
Because where is that? 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, about wood, hay, stubble, and precious gold. And so I can't remember where it's at. You know, when we stand before the Lord, and some of our stuff's going to be burned right up, you know. And some of us will have some things to lay at the Lord's feet. But it is true. What are we doing with our lives now? We ain't got a chance when you're on the deathbed and, let's back it up a little bit. You know, I'm not ready to go, you know, I'm ready to go to meet the Lord, but I got some things I want to straighten out before I get there. You know. Anybody else? Anything else? Yes, sir. And you think about why is that called a dash? Because you dash through your life almost. Yep. Yep. Anybody else? Anything else? All right, we'll go to the Lord in